start with introductions just so that everybody knows who's on the call. When I call your name, I'll call your first name and you just introduce who you are and who you're representing. If you are not a member of the committee and you are just a member of the public who's joining, that's fine too. Just let us know that. And so just real quick, introduce yourself and the perspective that you're bringing into this meeting. And I'm going to call on you by, looks like first name. All right, Anjanette.
Hello, my name's Anjanette Pelletier, and I'm a Fremont community member, and I have been a lifelong educator and currently am interested in this budget committee because I help districts across the state with their special ed budgets.
Excellent. Diane.
Yes, I'm Diane Jones, trustee for Area 3.
Ganesh.
Hi, Ganesh here, community member, Irvington Unified School area.
Henry.
Hi, everyone. I'm a part of Surf 40 and I'm a senior at John F. Kennedy High School.
James.
Hi, everyone. James Arcala, Director of Budget, here with Fremont Unified.
Kathleen.
Hi, Kathleen. I think I'm a member at large and a former member of several FUSD committees, oversight committees, and a variety of other things.
Wonderful. Luis, I'm not sure if you're here as a participant or if you're just here doing the tech, but if you want to introduce yourself, feel free. He's our tech guy, so he may just be on as the functioning for recording. Sharmila.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sharmila Balasubramanian, the budget manager for Fremont Unified School District. Nice to meet everyone.
Steve.
Hi, I'm Stephen Musto. I'm the FSMA representative.
Victoria. No? All right. Yoga.
Hi, I go by Yokes. I'm a parent of a high schooler. Nice meeting you all. Thank you.
And Zamil.
Hello, everyone. My name is Emil. I'm one of the larger community members, and I bring the represent the student side. So thank you.
Terrific. Is there anybody I missed?
Sorry, you probably didn't miss me. I think I was supposed to go after Mr. Musto.
Yes, I introduced you, but then we heard a silence. So
yes, and I was saying, "Oh, it's so nice to see Steve," and then I lost my place and didn't hear that V was next.
Yeah, I don't think we didn't hear that. Welcome, yeah. Victoria. I'm glad you're on.
Thank you.
And Victoria, do you want to represent or explain who?
I think that's my 6-year-old above my head. So he's currently he's a Spanish dual immersion program student at Blake Howe and is my second of 3 children to go through Fremont.
Excellent, wonderful, welcome. All right, folks. Well, today we have 2 agenda items. The first is I'm going to give you a preview into the deck that we'll be presenting for budget reductions. And then James is going to give you just a real quick overview of first interim. It's important to remember that both of these items are going to be presented in more detail at the board meeting on December 18th, but we want to give a preview and answer any questions that you may have. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get us started on the budget side. And you'll excuse me for a minute. I got to grab the... Okay. Come on, here we go. Okay, share. There it is. Share. And... start slideshow. All right. So there are 2 things that are happening in this upcoming board meeting that are different from where we've been in the past. The first is that we will be presenting the first interim budget, which James will be talking a little bit more about. And his big area of focus is kind of helping you understand the assumptions that we make in building budgets and first interims and what we're really looking at in terms of what's changing and what's coming in, right? And so the first interim is the first official time the reports around which need to be reported both to the public and to the county, where we look into how does our actual spending compare to what we had anticipated our budget might be at the beginning of the year. And prior to this conversation, as we were developing the board or the balanced budget reduction potentials, we've been operating mainly on data that was unofficial prior to the official interim update. And so what's good about where we are on December 18th is that in conjunction with the reduction conversations is we have a much clearer picture into how much we're actually going to need to reduce based on our actual spending rather than on our assumed spending based on budgets prior. James, would you say that's an accurate representation of the two conversations?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And so I'm going to actually start with the second one, and that is the balanced budget scenarios post first interim. So this is the deck that was posted last night. We were getting final corrections made over the weekend. And so you can access it on the board deck as well. And so prior to first interim, our original context and goal was that due to a $25 million planned deficit spending on the unrestricted side, plus a $9.3 million one-time funds expiration on the restricted side, we had a target of around $34 million. And between September 18th and October 23rd, that number went down $2 million. And the reason is because we got a clearer picture into how money was being spent. And we made some assumptions about some open positions that we were not going to fill that year or this year and so forth. We also knew that we had increased enrollment based on assumptions, but we also knew that some costs went up, particularly in special ed. But overall, the reason why this is happening is because we have 2,500 fewer students than we did in 2020. And when you have fewer students, you have decreased revenue. And even though during COVID, we were, quote, held harmless based on our enrollment status, we are no longer held harmless. Plus, we've had rising costs of inflation, statutory retirement increases, and cost of living salary adjustments for staff. And we also are dealing with this elimination of one-time pandemic funding. So the question that we've been asking ourselves is, what are we going to do about that? Because by 26, 27, if we did not make any reductions, and because of our mandated 3% reserves, we would be insolvent by 26, 27. And so we know that the budget that we presented this at the beginning of the year to the county received conditional approval, which means we did not have a full stamp of approval for our budget unless we made cuts. And those cuts really are about $34 million. And so we are in need right now. It's not an emergency situation yet. It would be next year if we continue to deficit spend and didn't make these cuts. But prior to the 25-26 school year, we want to balance that budget, and we want to have an idea of when we're going to stop deficit spending so that we can get those free and clear approvals. A very illustrative example of why that's so important is we are going out to the market very soon to purchase our first round of to sell our first round of bonds for Measure M that was approved. And if we do not plan for these reductions in the next time that we submit our report to the county, which is around March, if we don't make plans to do this, and if they're not improved in January, that in March, when we go out to purchase or to sell the bonds, the county actually has to sell them for us because we don't have a fully approved budget at this point in time. So that's a perfect example of why it's really important that we get all of this taken care of. So how did we get here? Just as a reminder, we're going to go through the one-time funding. The three areas are Measure I parcel tax ending at the end of this year, educator effectiveness grant ending at the end of next year, but already we don't have enough money to pay for what we currently are paying for, so we have to reduce it by half this year, and then it all goes away at the end of next year. And then the Learning Recovery Block Grant is $4.8 million of funding. We want to use that differently to extend the life of the counselors and the LMT for 2 more years, which means that some of the other things that we're paying for in them are using those funds are going to be reduced this year.
I'm sorry, Eric, I have to interrupt here because I think there may be an error with the Measure I parcel tax number. I thought it was 4.3 million.
It is 4.3 million, but $1.1 million of that is required of us to put back into the general fund because it's basically science prep teachers, and that's part of the CBA agreement with FUTA.
Okay, I guess I'm just not sure why it wouldn't show up as a lot, because it is, we're losing the total 4.3 million. We are absorbing that part of it back into the general fund, but the loss includes that money.
You're absolutely right. We're going to continue to report it out this way just because that's how we've been reporting it out, but I'll make that clarification in the presentation. Okay. All right. So with those one-time funds, we also have to take into consideration our structural deficit. And that's a story or a narrative that has been changing. And the reason it's been changing is because budgets are based on assumptions, right? We don't know how much we're actually going to spend. We don't know how much we're actually going to bring in. That changes after the beginning of the year. And we learn a lot more before the first interim. So on September 18th, which was reflective of only assumptions, we believed that we had, in order to address the $23.1 million of structural deficit and the $27.7 million in structural deficit in 24, 25, and 26, we estimated a reduction of $27 million in ongoing expenditures from the general fund budget would end the structural deficit spending. And when you add that to the one-time losses of $9.3 million, you've got to figure about 36.3. And that's what we reported. Now, it is a little different, and we acknowledge the error earlier on in the year. We underreported the loss of Measure I by an additional $1.2 million the first time. That was corrected. And so the number would have been 36.3, but that was the number in September. Then on October 23rd, we did a mid-interim budget update. It was not official. It was just sort of kind of back of the envelope math. Based on increased revenue and also increased cost, we estimated that the actual reduction target was probably $2 million less. And we also looked out 3 years into 26, 27. And so you can see the structural deficit there. We figured that the reductions of $34.3 million would allow us the necessary, that would be the necessary reduction target to stop deficit spending and to balance our budget. That was on October 23rd. So since we last met, the first interim, which is the official document, so we're actually going in there and taking things off of the budget that the county can see and inside the system, right? We cleaned everything out that we possibly could. Mainly that was in the area of positions that we were not filling. And so these might be para positions that we aren't filling because they're being filled by contractor positions and we already have the contracts. It could be management positions that we just haven't filled and aren't going to fill. It could be teaching positions that we didn't end up needing, but they were on the books. There's a whole number of things that it could be. We were freezing a lot of positions that were open because of the budget reductions, and we went ahead and took those as a savings in the first interim. And some of those were on the deck. Not all of them were on the deck that we had presented to the board on November 20th. In addition, our initial reduction efforts are proving successful. We are seeing a reduction in the amount of money that just in general we're spending, which is really good. And so we're able to project those out for the rest of the year. In addition, the board has indicated their commitment to make the necessary reductions on January 8th. And this is key, right? And I'll explain to you why that's key in just a moment. And then also, since we last met, the board gave direction to the staff to go ahead and make the assumption that we would continue the life of the elementary counselors and the LMTs using the LRBG, the not long range, the Learning Recovery Block Grant to cover the half of the counselor salaries at the elementary school and the LMTs for 2 years of the remaining life of the LRBG. What that allows us to do is to take it off of our books for the next 2 years. And that helps the outlook for the first interim budget. So when you do all of those things, the structural deficit goes down to 22.1 million in 24-25, 27.7 in 25-26, and 23.8 in 26-27, requiring a reduction in the structural deficit of $9.8 million in ongoing expenditures to no longer deficit spend. When you add that to the $9.3 million in one-time ending funds, you get a total of $29.1 million. So to go from 36.3 to $29.1 million, it shows that all of these conversations, all of the things that we're doing, and the clarification of how much we're actually spending between our budget to first interim is going well. It's going in the direction that we want it to go. We don't have, since October 23rd, we haven't had any big expenditures in special ed or legal expenses or insurance claims or anything like that. And in addition to that, our UPP percentage, which is our unduplicated pupil percentage, is going up, which means we have more students who are either low income or English language learners, and that's by about, I think, 2.5%, maybe 3%. So that's a big increase, which this year we realize some increase in revenue. Next year we realize a much larger increase just on that 3% UPP. And then in addition, all of those other things, the counselors, the LMTs, all of that get us down to this number. Now, remember, the first interim report is like the halfway point of the school year. And so another thing that we're going to be doing is basically telling everybody, if you haven't encumbered your expenses, right? Meaning if you haven't said in your budget, this is what we're spending it on, then in very short order before the second interim, we're going to be pulling all of that money back to see if we can get even more savings. But right now that money is available based on the budgets that were given to each department and each site. But my goal is we have very, very little carryover. And if we're going to have any carryover, we know it now so we can make fewer cuts or bring back people that maybe initially got a layoff notice. So this is going back to the really important information. With the decreased cut target and a commitment to reduce. So we have to make these cuts. This is like a 3 or 4-legged stool and everything depends on the other. And so if the board is not committed or doesn't make the necessary cuts, then everything else falls away in terms of what it is that we're trying to do here. And I want to commend Victoria for bringing something to my attention in our last meeting about how we're reporting out the savings of deficit spending or the set-asides for deficit spending so that we can very clearly show everybody that we have every intention of no money falling out, and we're no longer going to plan for money to fall out from year to year. So if these two things are true, a decreased cut target and a commitment to reduce, the $21.9 million in one-time set aside that was set aside for deficit spending in 26-27, because we haven't made any reductions yet. And until the board takes action, we have to continue to plan for the necessary money to be able to cover all of our costs. And the way that was done in the past up till now was through this deficit spending set aside. We are no longer going to do that. We're going to move that money into the budget. And if we do that by both a decreased cut target, a commitment to make these cuts that we need to make, and an infusion of this one-time money into the budget, would that provide us with a longer runway to accomplish 4 positive outcomes? The first is an even further reduced cut target. So from $29 million to something else. An improved compensation offer to employees, which we have presented to our 2 remaining unions, and then are in conversations with them as we speak. I don't want to say much about what was offered. What I can say will be put on a negotiations update on the website probably tomorrow, if it's not already. The person who puts them on the website, Bart Payne, is actually on a personal day today. So if it isn't up there today, it's just because he's not here, and it'll be put on tomorrow. But we do have an improved compensation offer to our employees. I'm a big believer that our teachers and our staff deserve as much as we can give them. I can honestly say this is a stretch offering what we're offering, but it's something that I think we need to do and that our teachers and our staff deserve, and the board is been supportive thus far. Positive certification from ACOE. So I don't want to play games with our certification because we need to get those bonds purchased. So we need a 3-year budget with 3% reserves, and ACOE needs to give us the green light before March so that we can get those bonds. And I am committed to stop deficit spending. But what that means is I'm also not going to save money aside. The budget is going to plan for a roll down of deficit spending, and it's just going to be part of the budget. It's not going to be its own separate line item. And so if we could get these 4 things by a decreased cut target, commitment to reduce, and the infusion of these one-time funds into the solution, what would our cut target be if that $21.9 million of deficit spending was extended in order to achieve our following these 4 goals? And the answer is $24.7 million. And these are real cuts, right? These are not like playing with the numbers. As far as like calculating this, it also could not, it's possible to not involve one-time funds or one-time savings. It's based on the possibility of ongoing savings. Now, you could get there by doing a one-time savings of, let's say, a furlough day, but that just kicks the can down 1 more year. It doesn't solve your problem. All right, so this is what our MYP would look like. 38.2 this year, 8.4 next year, 5.2 the following year, 3.0 the next year, and then we would end deficit spending by 28-29, okay? So the way that I'm going to present the conversation to the board is sort of easiest, or easiest meaning no layoffs. We kind of all agree that it's like something we should do and can do. It doesn't impact anybody's employment, all the way down to the hardest cuts. And then in there's some not hard cuts, but they're complicated in terms of what needs to happen in order for them to come to pass. So the first thing is I acknowledge that some of the ideas that we presented on November 20th don't actually create savings to the general fund. So I've split them out so there's no confusion. And so I will just remind the board that we have some categorical savings that are basically we're saving in categorical areas by moving to other categorical areas, or we're creating space within a categorical area to focus on different priorities. So for example, everything that we save in the LCAP is going to be going towards intervention teachers that are no longer going to be funded by the Learning Recovery Block Grant, okay? So the categorical savings are listed on 2 slides. Again, they don't impact the general fund. These categorical savings on the second slide are all related to facilities and maintenance. We may not need all of them. It all depends on how much money we need to get to that 8150 account, which is the 3% of our total operating budget going to deferred maintenance. Okay, it's all inside baseball, but basically it's like if we need more space for actual deferred maintenance rather than staff within deferred maintenance, this is where we would take it. And these are all open or soon to be open positions. Okay, So the first one is acknowledging current savings that we couldn't get in by the deadline of the first interim. So they're savings we can realize this year, but weren't included in the first interim, but will be included by the second interim. They're mostly eliminating positions that are currently open. And that would be a total of $675,000 in savings. And you can see here, in these running slide decks, I've got $24.7 million is our total cut target, right, that we talked about earlier. I'm subtracting this total savings here from the 24.7, and that gives us 24.0, basically $24 million in remaining cuts after we make these cuts. Next are 24-25 reductions and reassignments. So these are reassignments mostly from the general fund, not reassignments of staff, but reassignments of funding, as well as just savings that we intend to get by doing things this year. So these are going to be this year, starting this year's savings, but again, they weren't in the first interim. So that's $2.6 million in savings. You subtract that from the 24 from the slide before, that gets us to $21.3 million. Then step 3. Now, all of these that are listed, remember, were listed there's 1 or 2 exceptions that were listed in the November 20th slide deck. That's where all of this is coming from. So step 3, by the way, GF means general fund. So tighter and equitable staffing standards. So this was in the original deck. It's all those areas that we're going to pursue that may involve layoffs depending on if everything doesn't shake out in the wash, but we're hoping that there are a few layoffs from this. It's basically making sure that we have equitable and tighter standards for staffing in all of these areas based on a formula that we will apply every year, which we have not done, particularly during COVID, which we just held harmless everything. That will save us about $3.6 million. You subtract that from the 21 from the slide before, you get about $17.7 million. Step 4 is special ed department efficiencies. These are all areas that were in the presentation on November 20th. Right now we have FICMAT, which is a state auditing agency, and they are auditing our special education services right now. I believe they're going to agree with all of these potential savings. It is possible that we'll be able to save even more, but right now these are those that I feel confident that we'll be able to find savings for. They total almost $5 million. You take $5 million from the 17.7, that gets you down to $12.7 million. Then step 5 is intentional reductions. These are us working really hard to reduce electricity, reduce legal services fees, to tighten up some staffing ratios in the elementary and secondary level in sort of in the master schedule piece. Nobody's going to lose their job over this. This is just like, hey, maybe one fewer section of, U.S. history across the board will save us, $180,000, right? Or something like that. So instead of, 28-to-1 ratio, maybe we go to 31-to-1 ratio. It's really about tightening things in the master scheduling piece of the puzzle. Reducing our site discretionary, department's discretionary budgets. And then this is going to be a hard one, but I think we've got to do it in order to get to our number, and it doesn't affect people. We need to, this assumes a reduction of $3 million every year ongoing. Originally, I proposed one time or just 2 years, but actually reducing our instructional materials budget by $3 million. This is the portion that the school district provides out of the general fund. It also hopes that we continue to have increasing lottery funds to help offset the hurt of sort of losing this. And so our instructional budget would go from about $9 million to about $6 million. And basically the net impact is we're going to have fewer adoptions. We're going to spread them out more. So we might use a math textbook one more year than we normally otherwise would. Okay. So that would save us total $7.6 million from the 12.7. That brings us down to 5.1, right? Next is miscellaneous reductions. These are things that didn't really fit into any other category, and they require some sort of planning or machination on the inside that just didn't fit into one of those other categories. They total about $1.6 million. Sorry, it should say 1.8. These numbers are off. The total is 1.8. It should say 1.8 here. I will fix that. So 5.1 minus 1.8, this number is correct. It gets us to $3.2 million. So that number is critical because 3.2 million represents the hard, what I would say are the hard decisions that we have to make. They almost all but one involve layoffs. They involve specific roles and positions that will go away and will not come back unless we have increased revenue and the board takes action to make sure that we bring those back. It involves some loss of some management positions. It involves some loss of some clerical positions, and then it involves some big, heavier, meatier in terms of number of positions. You will see there are 3 slides because there's so many. I put them over, 3. They're all the same. Step 7, general fund, step 7. This says A through H. A through H stands for the department that they come from. And you can see in parentheses are all of the departments. So A through H, it starts with A&A, which is assessment accountability, down to H, which is HR. And these are all positions. They all have people. They all have names. They are hard. The next is SI. It stands for sites. All of these are site budget related. You can see high school is presented first, middle school is presented second. The reason that elementary doesn't have anything on here is because all of elementary was sort of addressed in the redefining core. We are not suggesting any like flat out eliminations of anything at the elementary level. And then S through Z is student support services down to transportation, okay? Now, if you total all of those up, it totals $11.1 million in reductions. We only need to find 3.2 million. So this is where I feel like the board has where they should spend the bulk of their conversation. Now, whether they choose to do it or not is not up to me, but that's how I'm going to try to facilitate the conversation is go through step 1. Are we in agreement with step 1? Okay, if we are, then staff's just going to move forward on that. We're not going to talk about it again, right? So my guess is that by the time we get to January 8th, what it is that we're going to be talking about is step 7. That's what I believe, right? And it may go up if there's anything in steps 1 through 6 that they decide they're not going to pursue, right? So that number could go up. And, once you tabulate all the things that they agreed to, then the question is, does it lead up to $3.2 million? Now you could say, well, we could just do 2 furlough days and be done with it. Yeah, you could, but then you'd be back to that conversation. First of all, you'd have to get agreement, but 2, you'd be back to that conversation in a year. And is that really what we want to do? If we're gonna have to make these cuts anyway, do we not just want to make these cuts now? And so, but because I'm not an elected official and it's not my decision to make, I did put on the next slide. There are 2 big sort of, one-time things that are hanging out there that were in the original presentation on November 20th. The first is savings from furlough days. And we just remind everybody that if everybody agreed to it, because we do have to negotiate it, the total savings for 1 day of furlough would be $1.9 million for 1 day of furlough for that year. The next is one of the ideas that came forward from the board was, would the city be willing to pay for the SRO program for 1 year just to help us get, another year to see if more revenue is coming in, to have fewer layoffs, that kind of thing. And certainly the answer could be yes. I have a meeting. We were able to schedule a meeting with Karina Shackelford, the city manager, this week. I will be asking her directly. And, I will let the board know if I know before the 18th, I'll let the board know on the 18th. If not, then I will let them know on their Friday memo, but I don't think we can depend on it. Certainly if they say yes, it could delay, $1.1 million worth of layoffs. It's actually the earlier slides request a 10% reduction on costs from them. Basically, I'm asking them to pay for the half of the medical benefits on the police officers that we pay for because our employees don't get medical benefits. And it sort of equals out to about 10 to 15% of what we actually pay. My hope is that they do that, but that's an assumption made in slides 1 through 6. So it's important to recognize that if they agreed to this and they agreed to the other, it would only be a 1.1 overall savings. But then moving forward, it would be that additional 10% savings. Anyway, it's, small, but there you go. And then the additional considerations are, once the board provides direction on reductions, we want them to give us a priority list of what we start bringing back if our revenues come in stronger. We will continue to review the budget and save as much money as we possibly can. Remember when I told you we're going to tell everybody you have until this date to spend or encumber, and if you don't, we're pulling it in on second interim. Second interim is in March, right? So if we get additional savings, we might be able to say, okay, we're going to save this job and this job and this job. Staff will encourage those who plan to retire or resign by the end of the year to submit official letters before mid-February to limit the number of layoff notices. If we know that there's like 3 attendance clerks that are going to be retiring at the end of the year, then we can know, well, we don't have to lay off 3, right? That kind of thing. And potential funding opportunities presented on December 2nd that can start now will be pursued. So we are going to start the behavioral health reimbursement program in January, February. We still have no idea how much it's going to bring in. Our counselors have to be trained. Our nurses have to be trained on how to submit that paperwork. We have somebody on our staff in our budget department that's going to be trained on how to actually do the logging of it, all of that stuff. So it still remains to be seen how much money we'll actually be able to earn this year from the beginning of the program. But even if it's like $200,000, it's not nothing, right? And so we'll be really pursuing those strongly. I'd like to remind you, but we'll also remind the public, we have a new budget input portal that's available on the website. The link is here. That's how you get to it. We would love any additional input based on what we published on November 20th and beyond. And January 8th is the board meeting where the board needs to take action and give direction. And assuming they give direction to cut $24.7 million, at least $24.7 million, then all those other things can move forward accordingly as well. Now, if our union partners don't accept the agreement or what have you, then we sort of become in a standstill, and we really need to sort of, in my mind, we need to reduce the $29.1 million because we just have to be safe depending on, where we move forward with the budget, even if we can do something later, including rescinding layoffs and what have you. So like I said, each leg of the stool depends on the others to happen. So with that, I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions. And I'd love to take maybe 5 minutes of questions and answers. So we'll do it real quick just so that James can talk to you guys a little bit about the first interim, what the first interim is, the kinds of assumptions that we use to build the original budget, and then what we look at in terms of actuals. All right, Victoria, go ahead. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then if I need to reshare it again, I can do that. Victoria, you have your hand up.
Thank you so much. I had a couple yes/no questions that I hope are easy, and then one I wanted to hear about. So first, the counselors and the library media techs at the elementary school, those are not on the table at all through next year. So we wouldn't expect any reduction in those services for kids, but that could be a topic that we might go to the community about for a parcel tax for these elementary services that we know are good for kids. Okay, yes or no? So I see the yes. Good. Slide 13 in particular, you don't have to put it back up, but it had some facilities positions on there that you were noting. With the bond getting passed, are there certain things that we can cut, but that with the bond passing and things getting up and going with facilities, that some positions might get brought back under that umbrella?
Yes.
Okay. Great.
And those, just so you know, some of there aren't very many positions, like most of those positions are already budgeted either to the bond or the routine restricted maintenance or the everything that's not general fund. But there was two groups of employees that we found after November 20th that were funded to the general fund. One was equipment operators, and the other was, there's this small group, there's 3 employees, and they basically focus on water damage and carpets. I know it sounds very weird, but with this many schools, you need 3, and that's what they do full time. Those were billed to the general fund. We asked our attorney and we asked our, what do we call those people?
Our auditors?
Auditors, thank you. We asked our auditors if that could be funded to bond funds, and they said yes. And so that is something, it's like $670,000, and it's in the deck I just showed you, something that we're going to do this year. So we're actually, it's going to be, we won't see it until second interim, but that will be something that we actually realize in cuts on this side of the budget.
Okay. So I had a last question as a parent of a foster child who's been out a lot. Because another potential revenue increase had been doing adjusting to the new independent study requirements, where it actually says online, I read it after you had talked about it in your presentation. And like you had talked about, even just one day, it doesn't have to be done in advance. And I know Trustee Jones had kind of I had heard that kind of discussion, but online, like, my kid then is out, they end up having a surprise visit or issue come up. Anytime during the school year, we can recoup that. And if the teachers have to do the work to get the work to that kid anyways, then we could get the money back. And I feel like a pilot might be good to do that. And teachers are probably willing to talk to you about it if that's
so as we speak, Letty and Greg are working with, I don't know who the committee is, but there's a couple of teachers on it and maybe a counselor, and they're talking about what is a system that we could create. So I think it's possible that we might even be able to start implementing or piloting it like late winter, early spring of this year. But I can't assume how much money we'll make off of it, so it's not included in this. But again, anything that we bring in a revenue then becomes conversations about next year's compensation, about the following year's compensation. So I absolutely agree with you that this is that's not the right word. I absolutely agree with you that this is an untapped resource that we are very excited to tap sooner rather than later, and to create a reasonable, functioning, repeatable system that doesn't overburden teachers. And Jeanette, you're next.
I had a question about the SRO. Before your time and before this board's time, there was quite a long task force that did a bunch of work and determined that SROs were detrimental to the school experience of many youth. The research behind that is very strong. And then we had a new board, and that study was rejected, and SROs quickly came back. So I'm wondering if there's any interest on the part of either the board or the district in revisiting that very thorough and research and evidence-based workforce study.
Yeah, so I would say I'm not in support of it. I don't believe there is a majority of the board that's in support of it. And so I will just say that it's probably not likely, just being realistic. And I also think that it creates a battle that is unnecessary, and it detracts from the good work that we are doing and that the SROs, I believe, are doing every day in our schools. I also think our parents are by and large against it. I'm a big believer in fighting battles that are worth fighting and that you can win. And I just don't consider this a battle worth fighting or that we'll win. So I would say no. That said, I do believe there are lots of examples of cities where the city takes up a much larger share of the cost of it. And that's what I really sort of want to chip away at over time. I believe there's openness to have that conversation there, but I feel like we've got to get through the city's got to get through their budget constraints, and we've got to get through our budget constraints before we can have sort of like an equal playing field of like what we want to do in the future. So I said a lot in a very short period of time, but I think if I go into too much detail about any side of it, it could be like this big other conversation. But I'm open to it. I just don't know that now's the time. Diane.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the LMTs being absorbed. If I understand correctly, it will be under a different formula. It won't be the current formula. So we will see some reductions in LMT hours at the elementary school, whether it's based on an existing formula or a revised formula, it's still a reduction overall.
Yes, that is true. There are two reduction options that have been presented. And one of them is to go back to the formula that is on the books that we don't use. And the other is to go back to, or to go to a different formula. And that's under the realignment and equity across the board. In terms of services, students wouldn't see a big difference in the service. It's mostly on the like prep side and the amount of time the LMTs have to sort of, put books on shelves and so on and so forth. But in the budgeting, I have included the least costly reduction of, I believe it's $190,000 of the different options that we had looked at, but that could increase if the board wanted to increase it. And those options are in section 7, if you wanted to go above and beyond that $190,000 savings. But you're absolutely correct. And just to point out, the LRBG doesn't cover all of the costs. It only covers all of the LRBG will only cover all of the LMTs for 2 years if you cut down to the formula that's currently on the books. That saves us about $450,000, and that's about how much the grant has the capacity to cover. If you cut less than that, then anything that you don't cut less than that goes straight to the general fund. And I am suggesting that the board make the decision now to say, if there are not adequate funds to bring this into the general fund or new parcel tax monies, then half the LMTs and half of the counselors will need to be cut at the end of the 2 years. And I think that's being very honest with the community about the money that we don't have. And I think it's important that we, tell the community exactly what's at stake if we don't have the money. And by having the money, that means that the community's got to come forward with a parcel tax, at least as much as it used to fund us. I would prefer something in the exponents of 3, right? Or not exponents, in multiples of 3. I think that this community is big enough and has the capacity to do a parcel tax that's at least 3 times the size of the one that we currently have, or that is about to expire. But that's just me. I do not speak for the board. Zamil.
Just a quick question. So how will reductions in the instructional materials funding and will they maintain with compliance with the Williams Act, given that its mandate provides adequate resources and we're reducing it? Are there safeguards, or how are we going to maintain compliance?
Yeah, well, the safeguards are is that the state provides guidance that is more. That we can use materials for longer than we currently are scheduled to use them. So basically what it means is, instead of doing like math next year and science the next year and then world language the next year, you might do math and wait a year, then do science, then wait a year, then do world language. It means that we're not going to be adding a whole bunch of new courses that need new materials. It means that we're going to be looking at OER resources, which are less expensive than textbooks. OER is open educational resources. Think of that kind of like at college, where you have do they used to call those things when they would put articles together in a big appendium, and then you'd purchase that sort of Xeroxed. It would be online resources more than, hard textbooks and so forth. So it's getting creative. It really is. But at the end of the day, like, we are a significantly and historically underfunded school district. And until the state changes the way they fund schools, this is the only way that a school district like Fremont Unified is going to be able to pay their staff what they deserve and what they need to live in this community within a commutable distance, and be able to have a quality education. I mean, it's just the reality. If we were in a lower income area like the Central Valley, we wouldn't be having this conversation because people could afford to live, in a salary that's much less. And people will say, oh, Fremont teachers, Fremont staff, they already get paid really, really well. Well, yeah, they get paid well as compared to maybe other professions that are lower paid, and as compared to maybe some of our neighboring districts, but they don't get health insurance. And it's extraordinarily expensive to live in this area. And so what happens is we're spending all of our money on attrition because people can't afford to live here. So they live here when they don't have a family for 3 to 4 years, and then they move to Sacramento because they can actually afford to live there. And when they go to Sacramento, they get paid $15,000 less, but they can afford to buy a home, right? And so it's really important that we remember the same comparisons cannot be made outside of the Bay Area, right? And the way that schools are funded just don't take into account how darn expensive it is to live and how much you have to pay individuals to have a livable salary. And that's what we need to talk about more. Our teachers are not overpaid. They get paid as much as we possibly can pay them, simply because this is all the state gives us.
Thank you. Makes sense.
Yogs.
Thank you. My question is related to the instructional services as well as the pay. Is there anything we can do with the tie-up with community colleges to reduce the cost? I know that we do have dual enrollment in other courses. Is there any way we can avail of the existing structures to reduce the instructional costs? And
are you talking about which instructional costs? Like have them teach more classes so we don't have to pay for it kind of thing?
Yes. Or maybe at least providing the option, like for the courses.
I mean, we already do that in some cases. The challenge is that, we have obligations from the state that community colleges don't have, and it requires our students to go outside of school and outside of the school day when they should be playing sports and studying and maybe having a job to help their family out. So community college isn't the best answer for a lot of students. And so as far as saving money, where I see like the mutual benefit is on very specific high-level AP courses. And that's something that we already do and something that we will continue to work with them on identifying, does it make sense for us to be teaching this class, or does it make sense for them to offer it on our campuses? And that's really where it becomes mutually beneficial. We do have some cost savings included in here. It's actually not cost savings. We're just bringing money back to the district. So the district funds FTEs for the community colleges to offer courses here, and then we get reimbursed. But that money has been going to the high schools, and they've just been using it to like get a little extra money. And so we're talking about if the district is paying for that FTE, that money should come back to the district to reimburse that FTE. And so that's one change, but it's only like $150,000. But where we can do dual enrollment, we are trying, and it is something that we have a commitment when we can stop focusing on the operations of budgets and start focusing on teaching and learning. It's one of the areas that we want to grow and get better at. We have some great examples, particularly on the other side of the bay, of this working out and working out well. And so we're looking to expand programs as long as they don't cost more money. And if they have the potential to bring in money, absolutely.
thank you.
Okay. All right. I'm going to hand it over to James for our last 5 minutes, just to kind of give folks an idea of what does a first interim mean and where do assumptions become actuals. James.
All right, let me just share my slides. And I apologize ahead of time. I know we only have 5 minutes and it's like 20 slides, but I'm going to try to just hit the highlights, everyone, and try to leave some breathing room for a couple questions. So first interim budget, let me get here. All right, so just as an overview, at first interim, it's all the transactions in our financial system between July 1 and October 31. And so we're going to present that in December at the Wednesday meeting. And this time around, we're asking the board to approve our first interim budget as qualified. Qualified means that the district may not meet its financial obligations for the current year or 2 subsequent fiscal years. And so in our situation, it's the subsequent fiscal years, especially that 3rd year out, where we're not going to be able to meet our financial obligations. And we'll get to that in the next slides. So just as a friendly reminder, every single year, first interim is a clearer picture of our budget. And just as another reminder, our adopted budget is developed in spring. It's worked on in March and April and presented to the board and approved in June. And we use projections that's given to us by the state and school services and our demographer. And we use all those to develop the budget. Now that it's December, we have more actuals that have come realized to provide for us a clearer budget. And some of those actuals include the state adopted budget, which is adopted on July 1. We have our closing of the books. We have unaudited actuals. And just really want to highlight, last year we did a really good job, 0.4% variance for expenses. So we were very, very close. Our goal is to be within a 1% variance. We were within 0.4% of our unrestricted budget for expenses. And then our revenues were at 1.9% variance. And that's because of lottery and interest, which is out of our control. That was provided for us in the summer about the lottery rates went up and the interest rates went up, which is great. And we also had to budget for fair market value, which is just a paper transaction that says how much our money that's invested with the county, how much is that really worth if it was liquidated today. And then we have our restricted carryover with grants that was part of the budget. Now we have our October enrollment. We have all the kids coming. So now we know exactly how many kids we really have in Fremont for the rest of the year. We have our new enrollment projections, which will be also presented on the 18th. We have our payroll encumbrances. So now we have all the folks that were actually hired, and we see how much they really cost. And we actually get to see how many vacancies we have left over. So we reduce the budget and we explain it as vacancy savings, because if you have lots of vacancies, you're not going to use those budgets that were set aside for those positions anymore. You're really just going to have, for example, at the teacher level, substitutes teaching those classes, like long-term subs. So the cost of a teacher versus a sub, it's very different. So those savings are now realized at the first interim. And also we have more information about negotiations. We settled with one of our bargaining units. So we're able to budget for that. And so all that to say, we are able to put all of this in the budget. So these are some of the assumptions. And this is my last slide for everybody, because this is all I could get through today. Key summary points for first interim. So this is the major highlights. So for unrestricted revenues, they did increase by $6.1 million. And that's because we did see some increase in enrollment and unduplicated pupils, our low income foster youth and English learners. They did increase. And we were able to increase our budget based on how we closed. We have home to school transportation funding that comes. So that's based on how much money we spent last year. So that went up. And we also have interest revenue. So now we know interest went up. So we increased revenues. So that's $6.1 million in increased revenues. And then we have unrestricted expenditures. Those also increased by $1.2 million. And that's because we had this kind of overlapping in vacancy savings, which reduced the budget. But then we also had to budget for CSCA and FSMA settlements. So when we put all of those numbers together, we saw a very slight increase of $1.2 million in expenditures. One thing to note, we did not budget for FUTA and SAIU because we're still negotiating, but we did set aside $10.8 million in the ending fund balance to pay for 3.5% one-time payments and employee-only dental. It's not saying we're settling at that, but because we have a Me Too clause, we needed to put that in the ending fund balance per our county office. They wanted to see that in the ending fund balance. We also budgeted for restricted carryovers. We have all these grants carrying over, close the books, we put them in the budget. So restricted side will go up. revenues and expenses. And then finally, deficit spending and reserves. So we're filing qualified because in the current year, we're going to be okay. We have 3% reserves for economic uncertainty. But next year, we have 2.15% of reserves. In the subsequent years for 25-26, we're still okay at the county level, state level, because they only require us of 2%, but we are below the 3% for our district that the state, that the board requests to have a little bit 1% above the 2%. And then finally, the real kicker is that in 26-27, we'll be at negative 3.32% reserve. So we'll be negative and we'll be insolvent at that point. And this is if we make 0 cuts. We can't assume any of the cuts per the county. And that's the picture that's going to happen at first interim when it presented on Wednesday. Now, I'm going to stop here because we're at 5 o'clock. I'll go more details later, but if there's any questions, I assume we have like a minute or so because it's 5 o'clock. No, that's okay. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Your mic's off.
I was gonna say it's 5:01 and you guys are hardworking individuals with families of your own. I'm going to suggest that if you have questions, listen in on December 18th, but also as an esteemed member of this committee, you can always email James directly or email me directly and we'll be happy to answer any of your questions. Victoria, I see you have your lovely child there with you. Hello. Is this your child at Blakeout? Hola, ¿cómo estás, niño?
Hi.
Hola, ¿cómo estás?
Dile muy bien, gracias. Mucho gusto.
Qué bueno, mucho gusto a usted. All right, everyone, you have a wonderful evening and please reach out to us if you have specific questions and we'll see you online or in person on the 18th.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
See ya.
Bye-bye.